You're listening to Say the World, an international writing podcast. I'm Mike Meginnis, the communications coordinator at the International Writing Program.
And I'm Christopher Merrill, the director of the International Writing Program, or IWP.
We have been, up to this point, focusing with this podcast on interviews with our 2023 fall residency cohort, which made sense to do because we had them available to record interviews with us, and you want to make sure that you get folks while you have them in the country. It's a lot harder once they leave. But now we're sort of shifting in the period before we begin our 2024 fall residency, and we're going to spend some time talking with translators and people who are involved in publishing translated writing, but we're also going to be speaking to staff from the IWP. And so it makes sense to begin with Chris.
Begin at the top.
Exactly. And we'll work our way down. And by the end of it, I'll interview myself.
Yeah. Now that will be interesting.
I'll do the sort of voice anonymizer thing that they do for like witnesses on in trials where they're afraid that the mob is going to get the witness. It'll sound all scary.
Slow it down. Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought that we could sort of frame this conversation around the book that you just released, which is called After the Fact, and it has 2 volumes in it, one of which is called If and When, and the other is Here and Now. And you co-authored this with Marvin Bell, who, so I don't know, actually, I was going to start to explain that. I think I should just let you explain it. If you could talk a little bit about your collaboration with Marvin and your the state in which it reaches the public.
I had known Marvin since 1978. I met him at the Breadloaf Writers Conference. Longtime professor at the Iowa Writers Workshop. He taught there for 40 years, much honored, much acclaimed poet. And I got to know him pretty well starting in the late 1980s when he had a sabbatical year in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where my wife and I were caretakers of a small estate on the edge of the national forest. Marvin would call me almost every morning and we would gossip and talk about poetry and various kinds of things. And a friendship just began to blossom. When I came here to the University of Iowa in 2000, of course, Marvin was one of the first people that I looked up, and we renewed our friendship, started spending more and more time together. He retired from the Writers' Workshop in 2006, and it was around that time that we started thinking about different ways that we might collaborate. The first collaboration was to celebrate the IWP's 40th anniversary when we wrote a book together over the course of 4 days called 7 Poets, 4 Days, 1 Book. I brought together poets from Malta, Hungary, Slovenia, Russia, and the United States. And we had so much fun doing that in the succeeding years, from time to time, we would talk about doing another kind of collaboration. Eventually, we finally started what became After the Fact. We published the first volume in 2016. It consisted of 90 what would look like prose poems. We preferred to call them paras, short for paragraphs, and they fell somewhere between poetry and nonfiction, and finished writing that book and then started to write the next one and just kind of kept on going.
The idea for this book came, as I understand it, partly from the example of this collaboration, right? The 2 books that this collaboration has produced came partly from a book that Marvin Bell had worked on before with William Stafford, right?
Yeah, Marvin was 20 years my elder, so another generation of poets. And it turned out in the late 70s, early 80s, he undertook the same kind of collaboration with William Stafford, who was about 20 years his elder, and I loved that book. It was called Segways, and I remember in one particular case, a poem of Marvin's called "It's," IT apostrophe S, and then that drops into the first line. It began, "It's taken me a month to reply to your poem. Stafford was famously prolific, writing poems every single day of his working life. And Marvin, in that poem, talks frankly about having lost his writing for a period of time. And I just loved the give and take that each one would respond to something the other had written, not in a doctrinaire fashion, but just where wit and whimsy might take you. And so we self-consciously thought we'd do something along those lines, but since Marvin and Stafford had done it in verse, we thought, well, let's do it in prose and see if that won't take us in a different direction.
My first thought when I understood what the concept for this was, and then when I started reading it, this recurred was a feeling of jealousy, uh, professional and personal, because I've tried over the years here and there to sort of kick off some sort of collaboration with just sort of anybody who was walking by, just because the act of collaboration seemed so productive, and it seemed especially interesting to me here because like most of the things I have thought about along these lines have been situations where the two or three or however many authors were sort of invisible, right? They've all contributed to one text, and the text is the thing, and you have some vague sense that there were different intelligences involved, but they're sort of disclaiming themselves. Whereas here, we have this, one of my favorite things when I read poetry, which I do, I'm not as good, I'm not as smart about it as I am about prose, but when I read it, my favorite thing is often sort of the gap between a line and the next line, or between one stanza and the next, right? That sort of space where sometimes there's a very direct, literal connection from one thing to the next, and then sometimes there's no connection apparent at all, but it was created by a person. And so you're invited to sort of productively imagine like what happened between those two things. And there is in this form where, Marvin is writing a para and then you come back. And sometimes I can see exactly what the thread was that got me from A to B. And sometimes I'm pretty sure, but it's not totally obvious. And sometimes it reveals itself like at the end,
Yeah.
right? So for me, that was such an exciting idea to have that sort of gap, not only the usual gap that exists between any two pieces of text where you can sort of productively imagine what the person who wrote them was was thinking of, but now we have two different people. There's a gap of humans. There's a gap of time, the time in which one piece was written, and then the next that is responding to it. And then there's also the gap of space. You're traveling all over the place.
Yeah.
He's traveling a little bit less.
Yeah.
So all of those things to me seemed like such a productive space in which to play and collaborate.
Exactly. And the fact is, I was traveling so much around the world, and Marvin's travels were confined to Iowa City, and he and his wife Dorothy had a separate place in Port Townsend, Washington. So his movements were more circumscribed. And part of the delicious tension of this is that I might be writing from Cambodia or from Hong Kong or from wherever I might find myself. And he was often writing from memory, and his memories would then spark memories for me. The interesting thing is that when you talk about the jealousy or what I remember at the very end, the book, we finished the second volume of After the Fact, If and When, just at the beginning of the pandemic. Unfortunately, about 6 months into the pandemic, Marvin was diagnosed with stomach cancer, and he would die in December of 2020. And so we had started the third volume, Here and Now, and we got up to the 29th para. I sent it off to him on a Friday, and a couple of hours later, he sent me a long email in which, among other things, he said what he loved about our collaboration was that it defined his immediate future for him. And I think I felt the same way. Whenever I got one of his paras, I was immediately starting to think what my reply would be. And then he started to sketch out what I imagined might very well be his next para. He was responding to the sense of betrayal that I narrate in the 29th para. And then he closed off, and all I could think was, I can't wait to see what Marvin comes back with. Unfortunately, a couple of hours after that, he sent me a one-sentence reply to one part of that email, and it just said heartbreaking. And within hours, he had a heart attack from which he would not recover. And so that became the end of our collaboration. And I can't tell you how full of grief I was then, and even now I am. So many things happen, and I think, oh, I could put that into a para, but no, that conversation has come to an end, which is why it took me forever to correct the galleys on this book, because I think on some level I knew that once I put it to bed, that really was the final page of that conversation with Marvin.
I knew sort of instinctively because the introduction makes clear that the book is going to end before you want it to end. And I had a pretty strong idea of what that last page was going to look like, but it was still real. It was it hurt. It was a painful thing to see and to know that you had gone through the experience that led to
Yeah.
that page and the things that were before and the things that were after.
It's funny, just I have not thought of this since then. What I loved, my publisher, White Pine Press, Dennis and Elaine Maloney, they designed that last page where we would have CM for my para, MB for Marvin's, and we got to Marvin's, what would be the 30th, it's just a blank page, MB, blank page. And now I'm thinking back in the 90s, I wrote a little book about refugees and humanitarians called The Old Bridge, the Third Balkan War and the Age of the Refugee. And a big part of that book consisted of interviews I did with Fred Cuny, the legendary humanitarian. And just as I was getting ready to put the book to press, Fred was probably likely murdered in Chechnya, and so I ended that book with a to the memory of Fred Cuny, and this maybe in some ways goes full circle because when I was writing that book and covering the war, I was in so much conversation with Marvin about the war, first from our friendship in Santa Fe, but then as the years went along, we would see each other, and he knew I was in the war zone and wonder what would come out of it. Well, this book is filled with some references back to those days, back to that war.
Yeah, another thing that was sort of a structure in my experience, and I think it was in the afterword that you sort of alluded to this as well. I may be misremembering, but there are references to death throughout the book that feel knowing where it's going to end and just sort of knowing the structure of the lives that is leading to it. Those combined with as the book gets closer to where we are now, right? As I recognize more and more clearly, yes, I remember that year. I remember that summer. I remember that event. I remember that horrible news day. There is this sense of gathering sort of dread and a sense of there's catharsis in addressing that, but there's also this sense in which, and I think this is the thing that I want to say I'm paraphrasing you on the sort of like holding it at bay by mentioning it,
Yeah, yeah.
but never quite really mentioning the this one of the underlying facts of this collaboration that is somewhat extra textual, which is that he's 20 years older than you,
Yeah, yeah.
and there's probably one way this is going to end.
That was I am certain that Marvin was conscious of it in the same way that I was. That we were having this wonderful conversation, and that at some point it was going to end with one or the other of us passing away. And when it finally came to pass, then that I realized, oh, there I could see that that was a part of the subtext of many of the paras that we finished.
Yeah, there are a few where it really feels like it kind of comes to the fore without ever quite naming itself, which is an interesting thing to see.
And I can remember so vividly the day that Marvin wrote to me that in that September of 2020, when he got the diagnosis and had decided not to have surgery, that it was really now would be just a time of palliative care. And he said, "So you're going to have to take this to the end." And I thought, yeah, I kind of feared that might be the case. And when I think back of many things I've done during my tenure at the University of Iowa, the memorial reading I put together for Marvin in November on the Day of the Dead, November 1st, that year when I got together a lot of his friends and former colleagues and former students to read from his work. and including people like John Irving and David St. John. And it was just an extraordinary gathering of readings. And it went on for close to 3 hours, and nobody wanted to leave because so many people felt so much love for Marvin as a human being, as a poet, as a teacher, as a guide, and in my case, also as a partner.
Something you mentioned that I wanted to go back to was this just the feeling of looking forward once you received the letter to like or the once you received a para to now I'm going to write something back. I don't know when it's going to happen exactly. I don't know how it's going to happen, but I know that that's coming. You wrote Marvin liked to call the study of poetry a survival skill, something that helped its practitioners live fuller lives. And this is a real fixation for me. This is something that I tell people a lot because, when you do write somewhat professionally, people will often ask you, how can I do this? How can I make money on it? How can I become a serious writer? And the advice I tend to give them is don't, instead learn how writing can enrich your life, whether or not you get anything else out of it, whether or not you ever publish it. Use it as a way of paying attention, of thinking, of being in the world, and being yourself more and better. And this is another source of my jealousy in reading about this collaboration, is that to me it seems like that's like central to what this format of exchange would encourage. But there's also, again, this collaborative multiplier, right? There's one question that any writer always gets to ask at the end of any experience or during any experience, which is, am I going to write about this? Is this good? Can I use this? And then there's this second question, which is, what am I going to tell Marvin about this?
Yeah. Exactly. And that's, well, remember, Robert Frost said that poetry is a temporary stay against confusion. And by that, he means not only the bewilderment of everyday experience, but it's also that sense of that larger existential angst that we all feel at various points when we consider our own mortality or just try to make sense of our walk in the sun. And I think that in these paras, Marvin and I were able, with some frequency, to be able to find for ourselves some temporary stay against confusion, and then had the good luck to pass it along to the other, who would then use that as the springboard for his own meditation.
Yeah, something I wondered about in reading this, again, because the gaps between one para and the next are, they're productively unpredictable. Did you ever send one and feel like, man, I don't know what he's going to do with this? Or did you ever receive one and have that same feeling of like, well, I guess I'm going to respond, but
Yeah.
I don't know how?
Well, I think that I know that I felt a great deal of trepidation with everyone I've sent on to him, wondering how he would receive it. And I guess that probably to a certain extent he may have felt the same with me, though he was 20 years older and far more experienced and acclaimed than I am. But I think that every writer has that sense of, well, am I going to be? How's the other going to judge me? Have I lived up to what I'm doing here? And it's in my case, there were many times that I would read something and think, oh my God, that's so great, but what am I going to do with that? And on those occasions, it would sometimes take longer for me to find something to respond. But the other thing that I miss about the not being able to do this now is that when I was traveling during the writing of this book, I realized on some level I was always on the lookout for material that might work its way into a new para, and it's always as A.R. Ammons wrote once about a long poem of his. He said it's good to have something to do in a natural suspension. It's a long poem he wrote during a blizzard, and I think it's always useful to have a task at hand when you're going someplace, a way to focus your attention, to take notes, to observe a little closer.
Right. Well, and there's that unconscious work that happens too, right?
Right.
Like the fact that by telling yourself, I'm going to be writing something later,
Yeah.
you assign some internal machine that does most of the work without your awareness. And at some point you sit down and you start work and you find it's generated. In my case, it's usually like, I don't know, 500 words, and then and then I got to let the machine spool up again, right? I gotta wait for the
Exactly.
next time.
Exactly. Or let the well refill itself, right? Yeah. Yeah.
I wondered too, though, because it does end in the period where we're still in, what it's funny. I never know how to talk about this, right? Because what people tend to say is during the pandemic, or they say after the pandemic. And of course, they don't mean either of those things because it still is, in some sense, the pandemic. But it is definitely my lived experience that I mean, you have experienced this just like in working together, right? Like you see me worrying about it less than I did before,
Right. Yeah.
right? And that's not entirely because the evidence tells me I should worry less. I just sort of I hit my limit like later than most people, but I hit it. Um, but for lack of a better way of phrasing it, during the COVID lockdown, when we weren't locked down. um, that's when this ends, right? That's when the composition of this ends at any rate. And I'm wondering how your relationship to the collaboration changed in that time, and also how the collaboration changed your experience of that period.
Yeah, that's a really great question because remember that the lockdown begins in March of 2020. My mother passed away on Leap Day, February 29th. We had known that her death was looming. She had Alzheimer's. So it was, grievous as it was, it also had an element of blessing, though, of course, neither my sisters nor I could do anything about it. She was in a different place as a result of not just of her illness, but of lockdown. And for the first time in the writing of this book, Marvin and I were now living within a few miles of each other, but of course we couldn't see each other, and all of our exchanges took place over email or by Zoom. Then he died December 14th, 2020. We didn't have the vaccines yet. I think at that point we really had no sense about if or when this pandemic was going to come to an end. And I imagine that had he survived until we got started to come out of the pandemic, or whatever it is this after pandemic glow is all about now, how his writing might have changed, how our perspective might have changed. We just simply don't know. And I like you. I feel like I keep thinking back to books that were written about the 1918 influenza pandemic. A couple of novels by William Maxwell and the poems of William Carlos Williams, Cora in Hell. And I think, when the people who survived that and then they went back and started trying to write about it, or they'd written a draft of something during the worst of it, how did they know when that time was behind us? And I think we're all sort of more relaxed, but we haven't quite put a name on it yet. And that becomes the task of writers to make some sense out of that slow way that we came out of the pandemic. And less and less of us wear masks now, and we just kind of think we think it's in our past, but some little part of us knows, oh, yeah, this could go bad very quickly, very fast if we don't watch ourselves, right?
I am always really grateful when I encounter art, and it usually is just by virtue of this being the easiest way for it to happen, things that were produced during. But I always am so grateful when I encounter art that acknowledges the experience of the pandemic, the experience of doing whatever amount of hunkering down a person did, because I find terrifying, honestly, the collective cultural amnesia, right? The fact, and I'm guilty of this too, right? Like I'm working on revising a book now that like should, if I think about it, have there should be some element of COVID in the world of the book. And there just isn't, because I don't know where to put it in there where it wouldn't take up too much space right now, because the naming that you mentioned hasn't happened yet, right? But like in popular culture, like TV shows that you've watched that started before the pandemic and then continued through and are still on now, those characters never had it. They never wore masks for the most part, right? Like the in our art, it mostly doesn't exist. So when I find art where it does, I'm always just like, yes, thank you. This is good. We're going to need this at some point, because at some point we're hopefully going to be ready to remember that that happened.
Yeah. Well, when you think about the sheer number of people who died, and I think about William Maxwell a lot in this respect. I thought about him a lot during the war because I think he was about 11 when his mother died. He was growing up in St. Louis, if I'm not mistaken, and so the Spanish flu is there somewhere. You know the mother has died, but it's a novel told from the point of view of the child, and of course the child can't make sense of that except that now he's without a mother, and those losses will shape most people's lives going forward. And it will be the task of poets and writers and novelists and artists of all sort to try to make sense out of what we lived through, or maybe didn't completely live through. So here's a para by Marvin called "How We Survive." Or not. The lights in the sky may be intergalactic aircraft. Or not. I'm not licensed to pull the rug out from under guesswork. It is a solace to feel that one knows. Otherwise, our best maneuver is to change the odds. The day I was transferred from the infantry to a non combat branch, I danced Dorothy around the kitchen. I had learned something from the icy roads and the leaky boats back when I thought luck was on my side. I knew little of the skewed, the lopsided, and the misaligned. I knew little of chance, fortune, providence, or destiny. I knew nothing of the boundaries of one's class. We were primed to be conscripted into the masses of pawns, serfs, and slaves. So change the odds. Go it alone. During my army tour, a military advisor convinced me that a candidate for president, one who might employ nuclear weapons, might win. I secured our first passports, one for my wife and sons, another for myself. I would be traveling alone. I must have thought I'd return if needed. I am old enough now to know that escape beats sheltering in place. Short termers know the payback has no end. He was prescient who said some things that happen to us are just bad luck. So when I received that one from Marvin, I think on some level I was trying to think about luck, right? Good luck and bad luck. And I unfortunately had some rather bad luck right at hand. And this is called Samangan, a place in Afghanistan. And you'll see also, I mean, the immediate inspiration, not just bad luck, but the question of the odds, right? What are the odds of surviving a high speed head on collision on a rural highway in Afghanistan? All I knew in the moments before a taxi passing a truck veered into our car was that it would hurt. My hosts, believing the Taliban would not disrupt our journey to a pre Islamic shrine in Samangan, had advised me to wear a light green shalwar and kameez, pajama like trousers, and a tunic. Hence, the man who pulled me from the car thought I was Afghan. A crowd had gathered, which suggested how long I had been knocked out, and they were yelling at the taxi driver. Both cars were totaled, and both of my hosts had broken their arms. A doctor from our group was cradling an unconscious boy whose fate we would not learn. What did I know? Where the Hindu Kush meets the Central Asian steppe, Buddhists carved a monastery in a hillside, which the Mujahideen later used as a base in their fight against the Soviets. The walls and ceilings of the caves were black with soot, but they had survived the Taliban, unlike the Buddhas destroyed in Bamiyan. Our guide, accompanied by a guard armed with a Kalashnikov, knew less about the stupa than the doctor, who drove me through a sandstorm to a hospital in Mazar-e-Sharif. The Taliban's spring offensive was about to begin, and after an attack on Kabul, with suicide bombers and gunmen killing or wounding hundreds of men, women, and children, its Department for the Prevention of Civilian Casualties warned drivers, quote, to follow all traffic rules, close quote. A sense of humor goes a long way in a war zone.
So I had this idea when I was making my notes for this, and I knew, no plan survives first contact with the with the enemy. Is that the saying?
It is
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I've put us in an interesting
the first
position
skirmish.
accordingly. But I had this idea that we would sort of go through time and talk about the sort of structure of this book and of your friendship with Marvin, and sort of in parallel. And the reason this didn't happen is that it doesn't quite sync up. Your experience coming on board as the director of the International Writing Program, how you came here, what the circumstances were, and sort of your experience of being here throughout this time. Now, I should tell you that I'm interviewing Natasha on Thursday. And so this has two implications. One is I can ask her for corrections.
Yeah.
And she's already offered those. She pounced when she knew that I was going to be interviewing you. She said, well, I can correct any
Yeah.
misinformation when I talk to you." The other thing is that you're in competition with her for best story.
Ah,
So that's your motivator here. But I guess let's start at the beginning. You started at the International Writing Program in 2000.
right.
Did you come in like right as the fall residency? At the time, was it the fall residency? Was it called that then?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
It's been called that from the beginning.
Okay, it's always been the fall residency, even when it was like 9 months long?
Yeah, well, actually, the residency. But it was only 9 months at the very beginning, and that was only for a few years. And then it became, frankly, too expensive to keep writers here for 9 months. And let's face it, too cold in the winter for many writers from temperate climates.
I'm still recovering from the shock of learning that we used to do it for 9 months.
Yeah.
It's unthinkable now. I simply cannot imagine. But so did you come in like right before it started?
Yeah.
Where were you in relationship to that?
Yeah, well, as it happened, I think I arrived about a week or so before it started. My wife was playing, as she did every summer in those days, a music festival in Sun Valley, Iowa, and I was taking care of my my young daughter, and the next one was on the way. So I arrived to a very small residency of about 13 writers, staying not in either the Mayflower Hotel, Mayflower Apartments, where they'd been for 30 some years, or now for the last 20 or so years at the Iowa House Hotel. They were out in these shared apartments far from school. We really had no program. I couldn't get a budget. The IWP had fallen apart in the late 90s, partly as a result of shifting priorities at the State Department in terms of funding, largely, I would say, because of mismanagement on our part. And so my job when I came in late August 2000 was to begin to rebuild the IWP. And I had managed in so many ways to avoid committee work and to dealing with accountants and auditors and lawyers. And very quickly, I realized that this was a skill set I was going to have to acquire very quickly.
Right. So what did you do before you were the director here? Like directly before, I guess especially, and then how did they trick you into coming over here?
Yeah, well, I'd been a freelancer for a long time, and that led, I wrote a book about the World Cup in Italy in 1990. Then I covered the wars of succession in the former Yugoslavia for many years. That resulted in two books. And in 1995, I took my first academic job, which was as the William H. Jenks Chair in Contemporary Letters at the College of the Holy Cross. It was a job I absolutely loved. I taught two classes a term, whatever I wanted to teach. I taught, no committees, no meetings to go to. I taught one of the two classes I taught in the fall would be a faculty seminar. So I was able to teach an entire seminar on the writings of the Polish Nobel laureate Czesław Miłosz, and we ended the class by bringing Miłosz in to give a reading, and it was glorious. And I had been there for 5 years when I got a call while I was on Mount Athos, the monastic republic in northern Greece, in the center of Eastern Orthodox Christian monasticism, on the eve of their Christmas vigil, which takes place January 6th and 7th, asking if I would apply for this job. At the time at Holy Cross, I was negotiating what would have been a series of 5 year commitments, would have probably stayed there for the rest of my career. And then I thought, okay, this sounds challenging, interesting. At a certain point, I thought, well, okay, let's try it.
Did you have a sense when you did that that you would then hang around for 20 plus years?
Well, here's the funny thing is the day I was offered the job by David Scorton was then our vice president for research. He called and uh, said he would take he was going to give me the job, and I went out for a run, and I was thinking, like 20 years, that should be the rest of my career. That's a good stretch of time. And that night when we sat down to dinner, my wife and my very young daughter Hannah at the time was 4, and my wife asked me how I was feeling, and she never really asked me that. And I said, I'm fine. And she said, "Are you feeling stressed out?" I said, Not particularly." And she said, "I'm pregnant." And almost the first thing that went through my mind was, okay, 25 years. And I mean, I joke about that, but yeah, I kind of figured that I would be here for the duration. I knew it was going to take a lot of work to rebuild the program. I had no idea how deep the rot was, and David didn't either. I mean, we faced a lot of obstacles, and I spent a lot of time talking to lawyers and accountants and auditors and the like. But once we got things moving in the right direction, I thought, oh, this is going to be interesting. Among the many things I didn't imagine was I had spent the previous decade traveling all the time, whether I was covering the World Cup or the wars or making pilgrimages to Mount Athos. I had kind of thought, well, we've got another daughter coming. Iowa City will be a good place to raise my kids. I won't really be traveling very much anymore. And that quickly I was disabused of that. And the other thing I've often thought about is I think my first week on the job, David invited me to a meeting of other vice presidents, and the then vice president for governmental relations looked at me and said, "We're so glad you're here, and we'll get together next week to talk about your legislative agenda." And I thought to myself, what the hell is a legislative agenda?
Yes. I have a guess, but I that's because I'm on the other side of it,
Yeah.
right? It sounds terrifying absent context. I'm assuming the legislative agenda was they were telling you here are the conversations you'll be having, or at least the places you'll be and the times you'll be there for conversations with people in
Yeah.
a
Yeah,
legislature.
pretty much would be, go to Washington, D.C., meet with our then Congressman Jim Leach, very moderate Republican, and our 2 senators, one of whom was Chuck Grassley, and the other was Tom Harkin, Tom being probably the most liberal senator at the time. And our VP said to me, "Yeah, you'll go in and have a 15-minute conversation, and they'll know who you are, so you'll all know who each other is when the time comes when you need help." And I had short conversations with both senators, but then I went in to talk to Jim Leach, and we talked for about an hour and a half about all manner of things, particularly in the Balkans. And he was an old Russian hand from the State Department, and so we found a lot of things to talk about, and that began a friendship that I absolutely prize, and we have remained close friends ever since.
Well, that's a good story. I'll check it with Natasha, of
Yeah.
course, but that's that's good. Um, So you came into a real mess of one kind, and then 1 year passed,
Yep.
and it was 2001.
And we have 9/11, and the interesting thing about 9/11 was that a week or so before 9/11, we had in residence at the same time the marvelous Israeli short story writer Etgar Keret and the marvelous Palestinian poet Hassan Zaktan. And in that first week of Hassan being here, the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, pulled up in front of the House of Poetry in Ramallah, which Hassan had co-founded and co-directed, and they leveled the place. And the first person who came to offer condolences to Hassan was Edgar, and that to me became a kind of touchstone for what the IWP can be in terms of cultural diplomacy. Flash forward a week, and I'm thinking, well, this will be the real issue throughout the fall. And then we have 9/11. And of course, that was a real complicating moment. And watching the writers, I mean, they were as astonished, despairing, in some cases perhaps gleeful about what had happened, though they didn't make that clear, at least to me or to my staff. But it was a moment that shifted everything in this country, as we know. What it did for the international writing program is that, as we will remember, there was a lot of questions in Washington, D.C. about why the rest of the world seems to hate us so much. And it was thanks to Jim Leach, who, along with Richard Lugar, then senator from Indiana, and Joe Biden, senator from Delaware, that they found the money to put together a task force on cultural diplomacy, to which I was appointed and ended up writing most of the report for. And that gave me a way to think about what it is we do in cultural diplomacy terms at the International Writing Program, which is to bring people together for conversations, for readings, for trading of ideas and impressions. And that's shaped so much of my tenure during here at the IWP.
I wonder if there's like a particular conversation. You've sort of named one, but if there are any others that stand out to you as really, I don't know, defining experiences at the IWP, either conversations you participated in or you maybe facilitated.
Well, the one that I'm often thinking of is there was a debate one Sunday morning between Edgar Keret and Hassan Zaktan, and they debated the situation between Israel and Palestine for about 4.5 hours, and neither one raised their voice in that entire time. They completely disagreed on the political terms of the debate, but they spoke in respectful terms. And I'm not so sure that I would go so far as to say that they were friends, but they were friendly enough to have the kind of civilized discourse that we imagine is absolutely integral to any hope for building solid relationships between two different peoples. And that's just stayed with me, that conversation. A lot of crazy things have stayed with me too, but I often go back to that conversation as a touchstone for what the IWP can be at its very best.
Are there other years? This is it's an interesting sort of dramatic structure, right? Because we start with the obvious event of your arrival and the sort of restructuring and the rebuilding that had to happen, and then we have one of the most dramatic events you could possibly have. But I'm curious if there are any other years that stand out to you as particularly important in the IWP going from where it was when you started to where it is now.
Well, the thing of it is that every year has been important, and every year has been interesting in different ways. And just to give you some sense of that, so we put together this report, cultural diplomacy, the linchpin of public diplomacy, and that came out in 2004, 2005. Then the State Department came to us and said, you know, you've talked in this report about the importance of thinking of cultural diplomacy as a two-way street. For 35 years, we brought writers to Iowa. So now the thought was, okay, are there ways that we can bring writers out into the world? Can we see what else might be possible? That led in the first instance to the creation of what we call the new symposium on the Greek island of Paros. We brought together 15, 16, 18 writers, Americans, and IWP alumni to discuss issues of what we hold in common, of justice, of what a homeland might be. And out of that came ideas for what we called the Lines and Spaces tours, where we brought American writers abroad. And some of those gatherings, I'm thinking in particular of work that we did in the Somali refugee camp in Dadaab on the border of Kenya and Somalia, and the kinds of interactions that the American writers were able to have with young Somali writers. And from that, we started to create our digital learning programs, our distance learning programs in the beginning. Then we started calling them digital. And then we got this idea, could we think of something to do? This was around 2012, 2013, to introduce American literature to an Iranian audience. We have no diplomatic relations with Iran. So I came up with the idea, thinking of my dear friend and colleague, Ed Folsom, the world's great authority on Walt Whitman. And I thought, well, since we don't have diplomatic relations and we have what the State Department calls a virtual embassy, let's talk about Walt Whitman, and we'll look at his incredible poem Song of Myself that's in 52 sections. How about if Ed writes an introduction, I write a poetic commentary, we translate it into Farsi into Persian and pose a question. See where that will go. Well, that led to Whitman Web, which now exists in something like 15 languages, including 2 different versions in Arabic and the first full-length Russian translation of Song of Myself. Lots of different ways in which we started to think about how can we bring readers and writers, different audiences, into a productive kind of conversation. So each thing has led to another until, of course, we get to the pandemic, and then that all hell breaks loose, and we find ourselves quiet and huddling and trying to stay alive. And now we're in whatever we call this post-pandemic time, where we have full residencies and our summer programs between the lines for high school students finally have them back in residence. And it feels like not exactly a new beginning, but it's yet a new incarnation of the ways in which literature can connect people.
It's really interesting thinking about, and I only see this largely from an outside perspective because I started here in the spring, toward the end of the spring of 2022. So in a lot of ways this process had just happened. But seeing the ways in which all of the programs had to sort of consider, like, what are the core things that we do? Which of those things are possible? What are the new opportunities that we have? There's an interesting spread in the first annual report I did for us, which is for the year before I came. It's for 2021, and there's a photo on, I believe, the left hand is all of the people who participated in the fall residency wearing their masks, even though they're outdoors, and it's probably not strictly necessary. And then on the right hand side there is a very similar photo of them, but now they've taken off the masks and they're sort of smiling. And there's something about that juxtaposition of those two things and the sense of negotiation, right? The sense of kind of muddling through and figuring out what is the best version of ourselves that we can be this season, this year. And we did have a couple of years of that question being really pressing, and then the sort of transition back into, as we say, the new normal, right? This sense of like, okay, what are the things that we can bring back? What are the things that are going to have to stay changed? It's a fascinating process to have gone through. Although I suppose it's easy for me to say that having missed out on a lot of the hardest parts.
Well, except to think about that, what we did in 2022, we thought we'll split the ordinary cohort of writers in half so that we'll have fewer people here, less chance of spreading the contagion. And so we ended up having a spring and a fall residency, which pretty much broke the camel's back. It was, if you want to know what it would have been like with a 9-month residency, that was as close as we were going to come to that, and it was for us, I think, just simply too much. But we did make it through that, and so now we're at a different place. And one of the things I think we were lucky about during the pandemic was because we'd started a digital learning process, we had all these videos that we did on craft videos on Walt Whitman. We had enormous resources at hand, and we were very happy to be able to share them with the public as we still do. It's all available, so you get the chance to learn from writers from all over the world and throughout all the years of the IWP's existence.
There was to the point of the 9 month residency and imagining it. I don't remember where I read this anymore, but I read a quote from you. I think this was a letter that you wrote to somebody. I don't remember who it was, but it was for public consumption. But it was, you said, my staff is tired.
Yeah.
It was after the spring residency and now doing a fall residency. We're pretty tuckered out,
Yeah.
and it was true. I mean, I'm kind of lucky I missed out on the first half of that because I was there for the second half, and that was hard enough.
Well, it makes me think that when we finished writing the Seven Poets, 4 Days, One Book, I remember that now the late Dean Young looked at all of us and he said, I kind of feel like a baseball pitcher who has pitched too many innings for one year, and I hope it hasn't ruined my arm. And of course, fortunately, it didn't for anybody. Dean went on to write many more fabulous books before he passed away. But there was a sense of exhaustion after that, and it gave me a sense that it's kind of nice if you put together a program, a book, a poem, whatever it is you're working on, that takes it out of you, uses up all of what you have to give at that moment. That exhaustion is pretty good, you know? Then we let the wells refill themselves and get ready for the next idea, the next project.
Say the World, an international writing podcast, is a production of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. IWP programming is primarily funded by the University of Iowa and the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, with additional funding provided by organizations like the Doris Duke Foundation, as well as donors like you. If you'd like to donate to the IWP, go to bit.ly/IWP-support. Links to further information and additional credits for this episode are in the show notes.